In our previous episode regarding Mars colonization, we discussed NASA's various plans for reaching the red planet with large numbers of people and large amounts of cargo in the event that Starship is not available. As a matter of fact, NASA's current plans for Mars still do not really include Starship, but rather alternative methods which include things like inflatable modules. And in that episode, we discovered that large numbers of personnel and cargo can be transferred to the red planet with a variety of different technologies, most significant of which are more efficient engines like ion engines driven by solar electric propulsion, and also inflatable modules like the Bigelow B330, which you're looking at right here. These sorts of modules can transfer as many as 50 people at a time in relative comfort, which is certainly enough to start populating small towns, or if we're talking 100 ships at a time, you could look at transferring as many as 5,000 colonists in a single mission. But here's the big question. Once we get there, how difficult is it really going to be to survive? We briefly touched on the various dangers and challenges that Martian colonists might face in the previous episode, but we didn't go into a great deal of depth, nor did we really discuss the best ways to protect colonists from these types of hostile environments and what is the best type of habitation module for a future colony. Is it inside a lava tube, as we suggested in the previous episode, or is there a way to establish a colony on the surface and in the sunlight without putting the astronauts and colonists in undue danger? And then once they are in these types of habitats, how do they survive for the long term in a self-sufficient colony? We're going to find all of that out right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to another Angry Bulletin. Before I get started, I would like to thank the following incredible people who have been supporting my upcoming trip to Milan and the International Astronautical Congress convention that's going to be held there. Paul Wrightson, Arthur Long, Brandon O'Neill, Jason Winstead, Richard Heyman Joyce, Ulrich Meets, Roger Slightum, Kevin Bloom, Glenn Buchanan, Carlton Little, Louis Basto, Daniel Schuenhair, Andrew Titus, Ash Dugum, Christopher Steyer, Ralph Goldiker, John Herron, and Benjamin Turon, amongst others. In addition, there are folks on Patreon who have supported this endeavor as well. This is the biggest aerospace convention in the world. Everybody is going to be there. SpaceX, Blue Origin, everybody you can think of will be there, and all the new technologies that they're rolling out. Amazing content coming at you, but I still could really use a little bit more support. I've got enough to afford to get there. I have enough funds to support that, but not enough funds to stay there for 5 days. So if that's something you would like to support, all the details in the description. Okay, let's get back to part 2 of our Mars colonization topic. Now, on the surface of it, it would seem that surviving on Mars would be very similar to surviving on the moon or other destinations in the solar system. You're pressurizing the habitat, maintaining the composition of the air, providing food, oxygen, water, that sort of thing. However, tasks on Mars are very different. For example, the food supply of a large space station or moon base can rely on space cargo vehicles carrying supply from the Earth. But on Mars, where a colony can only be realistically resupplied from the Earth every 2 years, things are very different indeed. Food production or even rocket fuel production possibilities have vital importance on a long-term mission. Even though the first Mars missions may have enough food for years, but that food is going to be more economical and more healthy if the missions can produce at least part of their food on the destination planet. as the technology for food production can be developed much more easily on the moon than on Mars, we have to realize that a future moon habitat is not going to be the same as a Mars habitat. So designing a habitat that's capable of maintaining human life on the surface of another planet is much more complicated than it may seem for the first glance. It's not just about building a place of residence for the human explorers or colonists. Indeed, they already have a place of residence because they're landing on the planet in a spaceship, unless you're like this guy who happened to crash his spaceship, starship actually in this particular case. But a long-term habitat is something very different. It is a little piece of Earth on another planet. The Mars habitat should be a proper living place for the first humans on Mars. It should save the crew from harmful effects. It should serve with fresh air, water, and food, and also it should serve as a comfortable living area for the crew so they do not feel themselves to be in a tiny private prison instead of discovering a whole new planet. So first of all, to determine exactly how difficult all of this is going to be to bring your little slice of Earth to a very hostile and alien planet, we need to determine what sort of challenges Mars actually presents. Now, we discussed some of these details in our previous episode, but not all of them. And instead of talking about the more extreme challenges, like what happens when you crash your ship, as this poor fella is looking at right now, we should look at some of the basics. For example, where should a Mars colony be established on the planet? Well, we've already looked at lava tubes, or just in areas that are more interesting, like the Tharsis region of Mars, which has all of the giant volcanoes, and at the eastern extreme, you also have the Valles Marineris. All of these things are far more impressive natural geographic features than anything that exists on Earth, and something we would definitely want to explore. And in addition to that, all of this is located fairly close to the Martian equator, where the temperatures are higher. The higher the temperatures on average, even though it's incredibly cold no matter where you go on Mars, the higher the temperatures, the less energy you have to burn in order to heat your enclosure, maintain life support, etc. It's a lot easier to do it at the equator. In addition, the rotational velocity at the equator of Mars is approximately 4.8% of the escape velocity, as opposed to 4.1% for the Earth, which means launching rockets at the equator is even more useful on Mars than it is on Earth. So establishing your colony somewhere close to the equator is actually a pretty smart thing to do. Now, what about seasons, weather, that sort of thing? Well, the axial tilt of Mars is 25.19 degrees, which is very similar to Earth's 23.44 degrees. So this has similar seasonal weather on Mars that we experience on Earth. And the length of the day on Mars, called sols, are similar to the day on Earth also, 24 hours and 37 minutes. All of this sounding pretty promising so far. But of course, the length of a year is considerably longer, 687 days, or 1.88 Earth years. Now, there's another difference. The eccentricity of Mars' orbit around the Sun is larger than that of the Earth, about 10%, meaning that Mars orbits the Sun along an elongated ellipse. And due to this feature, the length of the seasons on Mars are not identical between the northern and southern hemispheres, with Mars being closest to the Sun during the northern winter and the southern summer. This means that the weather is more balanced in the northern hemisphere. Summer is less hot, winter is less cold, with more extremes in the southern hemisphere, meaning that if we establish our base at the equator, it might be good to have it a bit north of the equator rather than south. And Mars is, of course, much further away from the Sun than Earth, with an average distance of 228 million kilometers, about 1.52 times further away than Earth is from the Sun, and the sunlight that hits 1 square meter on Earth is the same as 2.32 square meters on Mars. Only 43% of the sunlight that strikes the Earth strikes Mars in the same amount of area. To put this into perspective, Mars gets about the same amount of sun as the middle part of Scandinavia or Alaska. Not a great place to use solar power, a place that you might want to try to exploit something else like nuclear energy or perhaps fuel cells of some kind running off of methane. Now, we've already talked about the atmosphere in the previous episode. It is, of course, a lot thinner than it is here on Earth, but the temperatures are not as extreme as one might think. As a matter of fact, at the equator, during the summer, the temperatures can rise to as high as 35 degrees Celsius. That's about 100 degrees here on Earth. However, it can drop as low as minus 143 degrees Celsius during polar winters. So big ranges of temperature, but it's not anything like the moon, for example. As thin as the Martian atmosphere is, it does provide a much milder temperature than other planets in the solar system. Now, also, as I mentioned in the previous episode, there are perchlorates in the Martian regolith. This is dangerous stuff for human consumption. You don't want to eat it, and you don't want to breathe it either, meaning that spacesuits need to be stored on the exterior of a habitat. You essentially climb into your spacesuit from the interior of your station into your spacesuit without risking any of the dust and poisonous regolith from getting inside your habitat. But it can also be very useful. Calcium perchlorate and magnesium perchlorate are the predominant materials that are in the regolith, and both of these perchlorates contain 4 oxygen atoms. Lots of oxygen in this substance, and you can exploit it. It isn't easy, but at the same time, there is a very straightforward way of doing it without using any sort of chemical processes. As I mentioned in the previous episode, there are bacteria on Earth that naturally eat perchlorates and produce oxygen as a byproduct. As a matter of fact, the enzymes from these bacteria could be used to exploit the perchlorates, or rather the oxygen in the perchlorates, without even having to bring the bacteria themselves. As a matter of fact, there's a proof of concept design for just a bag of regolith, adding these enzymes or these bacteria in an emergency situation, producing an hour's worth of emergency oxygen for an astronaut if he were to carry these materials along. That would be very handy for this poor guy who's running out of oxygen very quickly. Now, the altitude of your habitat also makes a big difference. The Earth's atmosphere provides the equivalent of 10 meters worth of water against radiation. Tremendous amount from our thick atmosphere, whereas the atmosphere of Mars provides the equivalent of only 6 centimeters worth of water protection, which isn't nearly enough, which is why radiation is a bit of a problem on the surface of Mars, although not nearly as big of a problem as deep space. But if you go down to the lowest altitudes on Mars, say at the bottom of the Valles Marineris, which again is in this region we've been talking about so much, the pressure there is the equivalent of 11 centimeters of water. That significantly reduces the effect of harmful solar radiation, and also it reduces the effect of explosive decompression if there's any sort of breach in your habitat. So one of the ideal places to build a Mars habitat would be at the bottom of the Valles Marineris. It's almost exactly at the equator, it's at a low altitude, and there's also a considerable amount of water ice in the region, at least according to recent surveys. Okay, so now we know where we're going to build our habitat, but how do we build it? Well, as many of you have seen on previous episodes that I've done on this channel, 3D printing with regolith is a very popular concept right now, something that NASA has actually awarded some prizes to from some of the engineering and architectural firms involved in these competitions to determine who has the best concept for a Martian habitat. 3D printing with regolith is actually an extremely energy-consuming process. The material is available, but for 3D printing it should be melted. It means that the temperature of the material should be raised to about 1500 degrees Celsius, and then it needs to be layered properly in the printing process. Indeed, the necessary necessary technologies do exist on Earth, but this industrial process requires a lot of energy, and even if the walls are only a few centimeters thick and the habitat only a few meters in diameter, the energy that is necessary to melt the rock is in the magnitude of gigawatt hours or terajoules for a single habitat. The first Mars missions are covering their needs for energy with solar panels. The task to build such a habitat would take months or even years. Now, the problem could be solved by sending robots years ahead of time to construct the habitat, as is illustrated here, but there are other problems. For example, the walls of a 3D printed habitat are made of molten rock, which is practically glass. During the printing process, the material is melted and cooled in just seconds, meaning that the regolith pretty much becomes like volcanic glass, and the resulting walls are quite thin, brittle, and bubbles can weaken their structure. The inner pressure of the habitat should be close to about 100 kilopascals, and the outer pressure is close to zero, anywhere between 0.4 and 1 kilopascals, meaning that every cubic meter of the structure should be able to hold enormous forces, which a structure like this simply cannot do. The difference of pressure means that the inner air would exert 10 tons of force on every square meter of the habitat, meaning that pressurizing a habitat with 100 kilopascals worth of normal air pressure would probably cause it to explode or launch it into the atmosphere. And even if it didn't explode immediately, the first hit from an energetic micrometeorite would break its fragile wall. This is clearly not the right way to build habitats. Even though I have featured them before on this channel, I was frankly unaware of some of the drawbacks, and also using robots can be a problem as well. The chances of failure on complicated building products using only robots can be pretty high, even though an enormous amount of work is necessary to plan a space mission. A considerable percentage of space missions already fail using robots, and that's simply because we don't know enough about the circumstances, or we can't overcome all the difficulties. If we have to use several robots in a multi-step process, the chances of failure exponentially increases and becomes almost inevitable, meaning that humans actually should be a lot more directly involved in the construction of their habitat than has been previously suggested. So what about the idea of bringing Mars-ready habitats with you? Well, that idea, although a little bit more practical when it comes to the resilience of the habitat, is nearly as bad as the 3D printed idea. And that's simply because these types of habitats, if they are to survive the rigors of the Martian atmosphere, pressure differential, etc., they're going to be quite heavy. We're looking at 6 tons per habitat, and each habitat is incredibly small. Essentially, all that would happen is the astronauts and colonists would find themselves transferring from one extremely small, cramped metallic structure to another. Really, they might just want to stay inside their starship, assuming that a starship was used for transportation. And here's another problem. Oftentimes, the engineers involved in the design of these structures do not fully understand the environmental conditions that they're designing it for. Sometimes these structures are designed to withstand extreme winds and storm conditions. Those people have spent too much time watching the opening scenes of The Martian. Martian storms don't behave that way. The atmosphere is entirely too thin to produce anything resembling damaging winds. Now, these storms are sometimes electrostatically charged, and the dust can be a real problem, but the wind strength is insignificant. You would barely feel it against your skin. So you need to design a habitat that's suited to the environment, not something that you're accustomed to here on Earth. In other words, a habitat that doesn't encounter much in the way of winds, but does have a problem as far as air pressure is concerned and radiation. So what's the best kind of structure for that? What is the solution? Well, the most compelling design is one that you're watching right now, or rather a modified version of it. This was created by an architect architectural firm called Foster's & Partners. As you can see, they recommend using robots and starships, by the way, in order to build the foundation. But then after that, the idea is to deploy the same type of habitat that got you here in the first place. In other words, an inflatable habitat. For the same 6 tons that a metallic habitat would represent for a tiny amount of living space, you can have a living space as big as a football field and resilient enough to deal with all the necessary air pressures. And then, instead of erecting a wall made out of 3D printed regolith, you instead erect a wall, maybe not quite this big, made out of unprocessed regolith, because all you need is something to protect you from the radiation. In other words, you're piling the regolith up over the inflatable habitats. Now, what about the sides? The sides don't seem to have any protection at all. Well, here's the thing, they don't need them. As long as your inflatable habitat has enough resilience to deal with the pressure differential between the habitat and the Martian atmosphere, you don't need any further protection on the sides, because all of the micrometeoroids are going to be coming from above, and all of the appreciable radiation and cosmic rays are going to be coming from above. According to the Curiosity rover, at an angle of about 20 degrees or so, the Martian atmosphere provides more than sufficient protection against radiation, meaning that parts of your habitat could be transparent on the sides, and also, as you can see, the spacesuits are on the exterior of the structure, as they should be, preventing anything from getting inside regolith or perchlorate-wise, and also very large windows providing considerable amounts of natural light into the structure. This is incredibly important psychologically to any human being, except for the ones who are accustomed to living in mines. And even those who live in mines often suffer from extreme deprivation to natural sunlight. And there's another advantage to doing things this way. Again, if you look at the diagram, you can see that inflatable mirrors are also part of the design, increasing the amount of sunlight that shines into the structure. So the reduced amount of sunlight that you're getting on the surface of Mars because of the distance between Mars and the sun is being compensated for by the design. Again, you have a habitat that's being specifically designed for Mars and not for what you think Mars might be like if it were a lot like Earth, only colder. Now, speaking of cold, you also need insulation, not necessarily on the top because you have all that regolith piled on top of your habitat, but on the side, that's a big problem. There's nothing really separating you from the exterior temperatures. However, there's a way to do this by means of what's called vacuum and gas insulation, with 3 membrane layers, and the gaps between the first 2 layers could be emptied to near vacuum, while the second gap between the second and third layers could be filled with a heat-absorbing gas, for example, the locally obtained carbon dioxide or more effective freons. So with that type of insulation, that'll definitely help you at night, although you're definitely going to need artificial heating given how cold Mars becomes at night. But during the daytime, all of the reflected sunlight coming into the habitat because of the mirrors really compensates for the cold, and in many cases, you're not going to need any artificial heating whatsoever inside this habitat. All the increased sunlight coming into the habitat, eliminating the need for artificial heating, at least most of the time, and also providing enough sunlight to allow greenhouses and all the plants inside them to thrive. And this type of habitat does not require a great deal of cargo because, once again, the inflatable part of the structure, and that is the only thing you're bringing from Earth, that is not very heavy. And perhaps the most unusual and surprising detail with Martian construction is that solid, thick sidewalls are useless. They're not holding considerable pressure because the inflatable module is doing that, and their presence as a shielding from harmful effects is also unnecessary. So what's required is a habitat that does not have solid walls, but rather regolith piled on top of it, a massive ceiling that provides provides all the necessary protection against micrometeoroid impacts and radiation, and the extended size of this habitat allows us to form large greenhouses within the habitat area. These greenhouses are heated by solar energy and by simple processes that utilize the composition of the Martian atmosphere. You don't have to bring anything extra from Earth in order to insulate and heat a structure like this. And this solves the problems of the large temperature differential between the Martian days and nights. Now, of course, growing food on Mars has its own unique challenges. You need to remove the perchlorates from the regolith. You need to enrich the regolith with various types of fertilizers and such in order to grow all the necessary plants. But that is also very possible, and it can be done in a self-sustaining manner. Once your artificial greenhouse, hydroponics, whatever, produces enough vegetation, you can use the leftover scraps of this vegetation as fertilizer for future growth, future greenhouses. As long as you have an ample supply of water, and as I mentioned before, there's water all over Mars, especially in the region here in the Tharsis part of Mars that we've been talking about. Everything that we need in order to be able to survive on Mars is available. There will doubtlessly be other challenges, other problems. The ice will probably be contaminated with a wide variety of undesirable chemicals and probably perchlorates as well. We're going to need to figure out how to solve some of the energy problems for our future colony, but we have the technology. We have the innovative spirit necessary to make this work. I am completely confident of that. And I hope this short video has given you at least a foundation of information on this topic to prove that colonizing the red planet is not only feasible, but something that we can do in the near future if we have the will. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, stay angry about space.